She was pregnant, betrayed, and humiliated, but instead of breaking down, she flipped the table, literally, and turned the scandal of the year into a story of power, dignity, and self-worth. What happens when a millionaire's wife refuses to stay silent? You won't believe how far she goes to protect her unborn child and reclaim her life. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. I used to think I had it all. When I married Marcus Holden, it felt like the end of one fairy tale and the beginning of another. He wasn't just any man, he was the heir to Holden International, a global hotel conglomerate with more real estate than some countries and charm that could melt steel. At 34, he was suave, brilliant, and maddeningly confident. And me? I was a girl from the quiet side of Baltimore, raised among dusty bookshelves and the comforting hum of a family-owned cafe bookstore. I wasn't looking to be swept off my feet, but when Marcus came into my life, he did just that. Boots, heart, and all. I met him at a fundraiser for underprivileged schools. I was helping my friend Rachel organize children's books for the event when Marcus walked in with his signature stride, tailored navy suit, slicked back hair, and a Rolex that probably cost more than my car. He didn't look like he belonged there, and for a moment I figured he didn't. But then he struck up a conversation with me about Roald Dahl of all things, and I couldn't help but smile. He said he used to sneak into his family's library just to read Matilda. That made me laugh. Marcus Holden, the man who graced Forbes magazine covers, once hid under a staircase to read about a telekinetic little girl? I was intrigued. From that moment on, he pursued me relentlessly. Flowers appeared at my parents' shop every Tuesday without fail. Sunflowers at first, then tulips when he found out I adored them. He once flew me to a surprise off-Broadway play just because I mentioned how much I loved Tennessee Williams. And then there was the night he showed up outside my apartment, drenched in rain, holding a soggy paperback of Little Women with my name scrawled inside. He looked ridiculous, water dripping from his lashes, but his smile, warm and unapologetically boyish, made my heart do things it had no business doing. We got engaged 6 months later. He proposed on the rooftop of the Holden Grand in Manhattan. The sky was this endless swirl of orange and violet, and a string quartet played something soft and elegant in the background. I remember the way his hands trembled as he held the ring. Even a man like him, someone who could buy and sell half of Wall Street, was nervous in that moment. That told me everything I needed to know. I said yes before he even finished the question. Our wedding was, as the tabloids called it, a tasteful blend of old money tradition and storybook romance. Marble statues, champagne fountains, lace flown in from France. But amidst all that grandeur, I insisted on the little things. A table of desserts baked from my mother's recipe cards. A passage read aloud from Jane Eyre. A seat left empty for my grandmother, the woman who gave me my first book and taught me to chase the kind of love that didn't require permission. After the whirlwind, I moved into his penthouse overlooking Central Park. It was everything you'd imagine. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a baby grand piano, and walls lined with art worth more than my entire hometown. But my favorite corner was a tiny sunroom he had converted into a reading nook just for me. There was a plush velvet armchair, a teacup shelf, and an old-fashioned record player that crackled with the voices of Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday. "For your soul," Marcus had said. I melted. At first, life was beautiful. He was busy, always flying to Dubai or Tokyo or hosting charity galas, but he called every night, no matter the time zone. I volunteered at local schools, read to children, and started writing again. We'd have takeout dinners on the floor, still in our work clothes, laughing about boardroom disasters and silly tweets. He called me his constant. I believed him. When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified and thrilled all at once. I didn't tell him right away. I wanted to make it special, something he'd never forget. I cooked dinner that night, even set out candles in my grandmother's china. I had little baby shoes in a gift box, wrapped with a silver bow. I waited until dessert, heart racing, hands sweating. "We're going to have a baby," I whispered, the words trembling out of me. He blinked, just blinked. It was as if I'd told him we were out of milk. No joy, no excitement, just silence then. That's unexpected. He didn't hug me, didn't even finish his food. He muttered something about his travel schedule and disappeared into his study. The candles burned down to stubs while I sat alone at the table, holding a box of tiny shoes and wondering where the man I loved had gone. From that night on, something shifted. He was still present, technically, but emotionally? He was galaxies away. He became colder, more impatient. His phone never left his side. He took more business dinners, stayed out later, smelled of cologne I didn't recognize. I tried to dismiss it, told myself it was the stress of the upcoming hotel launch in Berlin. But in my heart, I knew. The man who once recited poetry in the rain was now disappearing one unread message at a time. Still, I clung to hope. I read every parenting book I could find. I decorated the nursery myself, soft greens, twinkling lights, a mobile shape like clouds and stars. I even painted the words, "You are already loved," above the crib. I told myself we'd be okay, that he just needed time. That love, real love, was patient. But something else was waiting. A storm I hadn't seen coming, and when it hit, it would change everything. Because a man can pretend to be a husband, a woman can pretend not to see. But a child demands the truth. And mine was growing inside me, one heartbeat at a time. I started noticing the little things first. The way Marcus stopped asking about my day, how he'd come home already annoyed, as if simply being in the same room with me was a burden he hadn't planned for. He'd toss his briefcase on the counter, kiss my cheek, barely, and disappear into his study with that damn phone glued to his ear. Sometimes, he didn't even take off his coat, just walked past the nursery I'd been slowly building with trembling hands and quiet hope, not even noticing the new curtains or the crib I'd assembled alone. I kept telling myself it was stress. After all, the Holden Group was expanding to Asia. Meetings, investors, time zones. That was what he said when I asked. On the rare occasions I worked up the courage to question the coldness in his eyes. "It's just pressure, Grace," he'd say, not looking at me. "You wouldn't understand." But I did understand. Because pressure never smelled like perfume I didn't own. It didn't laugh through closed doors when I tiptoed past his study at midnight. It didn't mean sudden cancellations of our prenatal classes, or him brushing off the name lists I spent hours compiling with a distracted "whatever you want." I tried. God, I tried. I made his favorite meals. I planned nights in, hoping we could sit together and talk like we used to. But each time he had another excuse, a call, a crisis, a client, and always that phone. Rachel, my best friend since we were kids, saw it before I was ready to admit it. "You're walking on eggshells," she told me one afternoon as we sat in the bookstore cafe my parents still ran. I was stirring a lukewarm cup of chamomile, pretending to listen, while my thoughts buzzed like hornets. "I'm just trying not to overwhelm him," I said, my voice too small to sound like me. Rachel leaned in, her hand firm on mine. "Grace, you're growing a human being inside you. You're allowed to want your husband present. You're allowed to need him." The truth hit me like a gust of wind in winter, sharp, cutting, and impossible to ignore. After that, I tried harder to connect. I showed up at his office one afternoon with a sandwich I made myself. Turkey and Swiss on sourdough, just the way he liked it. His assistant, eyes wide and apologetic, stammered something about him being in an emergency meeting, but her gaze lingered on the Tupperware in my hands like she wanted to say more. Like she pitied me. That pity burned more than any lie ever could. A few days later, the house phone rang, an antique landline that we rarely used. Marcus was in the shower, and his cell buzzed endlessly on the kitchen counter. I wouldn't have looked. I swear I wouldn't have. But the same number kept lighting up the screen, again and again, like an alarm I couldn't silence. Cassandra Lane. I didn't recognize the name at first, but something about it struck me like a cold hand to the spine. I hesitated, heart pounding, then swiped open the screen. The first message was enough. "Miss you already. Can't wait to see you tonight. Should I wear the red dress?" Then another. "Hope your wife isn't suspicious." My knees buckled. The world shifted under my feet. I scrolled, fingers numb, vision blurring. There were dozens, weeks of messages, intimate, explicit, unapologetically deceitful. They'd been meeting regularly. Late dinners, hotel rooms, business trips that were nothing more than excuses to spend the night together. One message from Marcus read, "She's hormonal, I can't deal with her tonight." That one tore something open in me. I dropped the phone, and for a moment I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just stood there, still and hollow, listening to the water running in the bathroom. My husband was singing softly, humming some tune I couldn't recognize. A part of me wanted to barge in and confront him right then and there. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the child growing inside me. Maybe it was the weight of the betrayal pressing too heavily on my chest. Instead, I walked out of the apartment, barely remembering to grab my coat. I wandered through the streets of Manhattan like a ghost. The cold air bit at my cheeks, but I barely felt it. Every memory with him replayed in my mind, now tinted with dishonesty. The day he kissed my forehead and whispered, "I'll always choose you." The night he laid his head on my belly and promised, "We'll raise this baby with nothing but love." All lies, all fiction. Like the novels I used to read as a little girl, except this story didn't end with a kiss in the rain. It ended with a knife in the back. I ended up at my parents' bookstore, where Rachel found me curled in the reading nook, clutching a children's book to my chest. I didn't have to say a word. She just sat beside me and held my hand. Later that night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by old posters and memories that didn't hurt. I pressed my hand to my belly and whispered to the baby, "I'm still here. I won't let this break me." But in truth, I didn't know how to move forward. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something enormous, something unforgiving, and the only thing keeping me from falling was that tiny heartbeat inside me. I couldn't unsee those messages. I couldn't forget the way he dismissed me, minimized me, abandoned me. Something had to change. But first, I needed to know just how far the betrayal went. I didn't sleep that night. I stared at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, where faded glow-in-the-dark stars still clung to the plaster. Outside the window, the rustle of leaves mingled with the occasional bark of a neighborhood dog, familiar sounds from a world I'd left behind. I had come back to this house so many times before. Holidays, birthdays, the odd weekend visit, but never like this. Never as a wife betrayed, never as a woman crumbling beneath the weight of heartbreak and shame. The next morning, my mother found me in the kitchen, still wearing yesterday's clothes, stirring a spoon in a mug of untouched tea. She didn't ask questions. She just sat down beside me and waited. When I finally spoke, my voice cracked, but the words came out in a steady stream. "I think he's cheating." Margaret Ellis didn't flinch. Her jaw clenched ever so slightly, but she nodded, as if some part of her had already known. She'd always had a sixth sense about people, especially when it came to protecting me. "What are you gonna do, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice soft but strong. I didn't know yet. That was the problem. I wasn't ready for lawyers or courtrooms or headlines. I was still trying to wrap my head around the idea that the man who once danced with me barefoot in our living room could be sneaking around with a woman who signed her messages with lipstick emojis. Still, something had shifted inside me. Later that afternoon, Rachel came over, armed with her laptop and a bottle of ginger tea. She sat cross-legged on my childhood bed and asked the one question I hadn't let myself say aloud. "Do you want to catch him?" I didn't answer right away. I looked down at my belly instead, at the gentle rise and fall that reminded me I wasn't alone in this. Then I nodded. Rachel, being Rachel, already had a plan. "We don't need to follow him or hire a private investigator. Men like Marcus make it easy. They're lazy with their lies. All we need is an opening." That opening came faster than I expected. 2 nights later, while packing up baby books from my old bookshelf, my phone buzzed. A message popped up from an unknown number. Just a single word, "Tonight?" I froze. My heart pounded. Then a second message followed. "Same place, same table, don't be late, love." And just like that, I had my answer. The number matched the one from Marcus's messages. Cassandra Lane. She had texted me by mistake. Rachel's eyes widened when she saw the screen. He's meeting her, tonight, and he's stupid enough to keep using the same places. I knew exactly what I had to do. For weeks I had begged for answers, begged to be seen, but now I was done begging. I was going to make sure Marcus saw me, and so would she. Rachel helped me get ready. I wore a navy blue maternity dress that hugged my growing belly. Simple, elegant. Not to hide my condition, but to highlight it. To show that I was the wife, the mother of his child, while he was whining and dining someone else in secret. "You sure about this?" Rachel asked as she zipped up my coat. I nodded. "He needs to be exposed. Not just to her. to himself. Le Papillon Doré was one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, a place that whispered money with every champagne flute and candlelit table. The maitre d' recognized me instantly, his eyes widening as I calmly asked to be shown to Mr. Holden's private dining room. I could tell he wanted to protest, but something in my voice, or maybe my posture, told him better. He led me down the corridor past rows of glittering guests until we stood outside a heavy double door. He hesitated. "Shall I announce you, Mrs. Holden?" "No," I said. "I think I'll do it myself." I pushed open the door. The room fell silent. Marcus was sitting across from her, Cassandra Lane. She was stunning in that manicured, calculated way that money often buys. Hair like silk, lips like velvet, eyes wide with fear the moment they landed on me. A violinist, tucked into a corner, stumbled over a note and stopped playing altogether. Marcus froze, his fork suspended in midair, a piece of foie gras trembling at the edge of his plate. "Grace?" he said, stunned, as if I were some ghost who had wandered into the wrong story. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply looked at him, then at her, then back at him again. "Is this your business dinner?" He stood, clearing his throat, trying to control the panic rising in his face. "Listen, this isn't what it looks like." "No?" I took a step closer. "Because it looks like you've been sneaking around with someone half my age while your pregnant wife is home trying to decide whether we'll name our daughter Lily or Isabel." The mention of the baby made Cassandra blanch. She looked to Marcus, suddenly unsure of her role in all this. "She didn't know?" I asked coldly. "Of course not. Why spoil the fantasy?" He started to speak again, but I cut him off. My hands were shaking, but my voice remained steady. "I hope the duck conf is good. It's the last meal you'll have as a man who hasn't been publicly exposed for what he really is." Then I did something I never imagined I'd have the courage to do. I reached for the edge of the pristine tablecloth, and with one sharp tug, I flipped the entire table. Plates crashed, glass shattered. A bottle of champagne exploded on the floor, sending bubbly foam across the room like a fountain of fury. Cassandra screamed. Marcus jumped back, his tailored suit now splattered with sauce and guilt. The entire restaurant had gone silent. And I, Grace Ellis Holden, pregnant, humiliated, betrayed, walked out of that private room with my chin held high. The maitre d' scrambled to keep up, whispering apologies I didn't need. I didn't even wait for my coat. Rachel was outside in the car, and when I got in, I exhaled like I hadn't breathed in months. "How do you feel?" she asked, jaw clenched, ready to storm in if I hadn't made it out okay. I looked down at my belly. My daughter kicked, not violently, just enough to remind me she was there. "I feel like I just set fire to the lie I was living in," I said, and I meant it. The silence in my parents' bookstore was a kind of sanctuary I hadn't known I needed. Back in Queens, the scent of old pages and worn hardwood floors wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I sat in the same corner I'd curled into as a teenager, between the dusty shelves of poetry and historical fiction, a hot mug of tea in my hand, the whispers of turning pages soothing in a way no expensive penthouse ever had. After the explosion at Le Papillon Doré, everything unraveled quickly and publicly. By the time Rachel drove me home that night, my phone had already begun buzzing with the first waves of fallout. Missed calls from Marcus, texts from numbers I didn't recognize. And then, not long after, the inevitable. A headline: Millionaire's pregnant wife flips table at high-end restaurant amid cheating scandal. The photo was blurry, but unmistakable. Me, in my navy blue dress, eyes blazing, walking out while Marcus stood drenched in champagne behind me. A second image caught the moment the table went over, silverware midair, Cassandra's mouth open in a scream. It should have made me feel small, embarrassed, powerless. But it didn't. For once, I wasn't hiding behind polite silence. I wasn't pretending things were okay. I had pulled the curtain back. And now the world saw the same truth I'd been choking on for months. The next morning, my mom gently set the newspaper down in front of me. She didn't comment on the article, just handed me a bowl of oatmeal with blueberries and kissed the top of my head like she used to when I came home crying from school. "I never thought I'd be a tabloid headline," I mumbled. Margaret smiled softly. "Well, if you're going to make headlines, better it be for standing up for yourself." That afternoon, Rachel came by with groceries, and we sat at the kitchen table going over everything. She was already thinking in terms of next steps, lawyers, custody, statements, but I wasn't quite ready for that. My body ached from stress, my back stiff from pregnancy, and more than anything, I was exhausted. Not just physically, but emotionally. I don't know if I have it in me to fight him, I admitted. Rachel reached across the table, taking my hand. Grace, you already did. That night, that was the fight. Now it's about building what comes next. But what came next was still murky. Marcus texted me again. This time, it wasn't angry or defensive. It was pathetic. We need to talk. Please. This press is ruining everything. Ruining everything. Not hurting you. Not I'm sorry. Just ruining his precious image. I didn't respond. Instead, I met with a lawyer, a longtime friend of my father's named Charles Maddox. He was in his 60s, with kind eyes and a quiet manner that made me feel like I wasn't just another headline to be managed. After listening carefully to everything, he laid out the options: legal separation, divorce, temporary custody, financial arrangements. I know it feels overwhelming now, he said gently, but you have more power than you realize, Grace. You have your child, you have the truth, and you have a hell of a story the public already believes. I laughed weakly. That's one way to look at it. And Marcus, he continued, steepling his fingers. He's got scandal, declining stock, and a ruined reputation. He's in defense mode, which means now is the time to protect yourself and your baby. Charles recommended drafting a temporary post-nuptial agreement to ensure financial stability and medical coverage until I decided on the final course of action. He also offered to begin a quiet inquiry into Marcus's assets. It's not about vengeance, Charles reminded me. It's about securing a future you can count on, especially with a child involved. I nodded. I just want peace. Then, let's build you peace. For the next few days, I stayed out of the public eye. The press hounded our apartment, then shifted focus to Cassandra once someone leaked her identity. Soon, she was getting her share of the spotlight, painted alternately as a homewrecker or a clueless pawn in Marcus's game. Rumors swirled. Some claimed she'd been promised marriage, others said she was suing for emotional distress. I didn't care. Whatever she had or hadn't known, she wasn't my problem. Not anymore. One morning, just as I was folding tiny onesies I'd bought online, Rachel burst into the bookstore cafe, phone in hand. You have to see this, she said, thrusting the screen toward me. It was an interview. Cassandra Lane, sitting in a velvet chair, tears perfectly placed, mascara deliberately smudged. The headline read, "I didn't know he was married. The woman caught in the middle tells all." She spoke about how Marcus had lied, how she felt manipulated, how she ended things the moment she discovered I was pregnant. She even said, "I hope Grace knows I never meant to hurt her. If I'd known she was expecting, I never would have." And then came the tears. I watched the entire thing in silence, then set the phone down. "She's trying to salvage her brand," I said flatly. Rachel nodded. "She's painting herself as the real victim. But she's not the one who has to explain to a child someday why their father missed every ultrasound." The truth was, part of me pitied her, but another part, a louder, steelier part, saw through it. This wasn't about remorse. It was damage control. Same as Marcus. Later that evening, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Marcus. His voice was tired, hollow. I wanted to say I'm sorry," he said. I said nothing. The media's twisted it all. I didn't mean for things to go this far. I didn't mean to hurt you like this. You didn't mean to get caught, I replied calmly. There was silence. I want to be part of the baby's life, he said finally. Whatever happens between us, I want to be there for her. Heh. He'd said her. He knew now. I'll talk to my attorney, I said and ended the call. That night, I sat alone in the upstairs loft of the bookstore, surrounded by shelves filled with stories I'd loved as a girl. Tales of heroines and heartbreak, of villains who fell and women who rose. I placed a hand on my belly and whispered, "No matter what happens, you'll never be alone, I promise." For the first time since the whole ordeal began, I wasn't just reacting. I was choosing. And I was ready to choose myself. The autumn sun filtered softly through the old lace curtains of my childhood bedroom, casting dappled light across the wooden floorboards. Outside, the golden leaves of the neighborhood trees danced in the breeze, rustling in quiet harmony with the wind chimes that hung near the back porch. But inside, In the little corner room above my parents' bookstore, my world was anything but peaceful. That morning, after another restless night, I lay awake long before the city began to stir. My thoughts swirled in tight, anxious circles. Every kick from the life growing inside me was both a comfort and a sharp reminder. This wasn't just about me anymore. Every decision I made now echoed into someone else's future. The scandal hadn't died down. If anything, it had grown teeth. The headlines kept rolling. Hotel tycoon's wife erupts in public outburst. Love triangle turns ugly at Manhattan hotspot. Who was the woman behind the flip heard around the world? That last one made me chuckle bitterly. As if I just upended a table for sport, not to expose a betrayal so deep it still pulsed in my veins like a fresh wound. Marcus had gone quiet for a few days after our brief phone call. But then one morning as I was sorting through baby supplies in the bookstore's back room, my phone buzzed again. "We need to talk?" Face to face, no lawyers, just us. At first, I ignored it, but the idea lingered. Maybe closure, maybe more games. Rachel was immediately suspicious when I told her. "Don't let him manipulate you. You already gave him more grace than he ever deserved." I agreed with her, but something inside me needed to see the wreckage up close, to confirm for myself that the man I'd once adored was really gone, that he wasn't hiding behind some illusion I was still chasing. So I said yes. We met at a quiet cafe near the law office where Charles worked. I picked the place. A public space. Safe, neutral ground. Samantha insisted on waiting in her car nearby, just in case things went sideways. When I walked in, Marcus was already seated at a corner table. He looked smaller. Not physically, but in presence. Gone was the polished charm, the self-assured tilt of his chin. His suit still fit perfectly, but he wore it like armor rather than pride. His eyes were tired, hollow, his mouth pressed in a tight line, as if swallowing all the words he wanted to hurl. "Grace?" he said as I sat down, his voice subdued. I folded my hands around my tea. "Marcus." The silence between us stretched long and uncomfortable. This has gotten out of control," he started, eyes darting to the window as if paparazzi might burst through at any moment. "The media, the shareholders, our stock is tanking. I never wanted to humiliate me?" I interrupted, tilting my head. "To lie for months? To sleep with another woman while I decorated a nursery for our child?" His jaw tightened. "I messed up, I know that." "No, Marcus, you didn't mess up. You made choices. Over and over again." He sighed and rubbed his temple. "Look, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just think we need to figure out a way forward. For the baby, for the business too. The investors are rattled. The board wants to know if the marriage is salvageable." There it was, the real reason. He wasn't here because he missed me. Not because he wanted to repair what we had. He was here because his empire was crumbling, and I was the loose wire threatening to set it all on fire. I leaned back, staring at him for a long moment. "Are you really asking me to pretend everything's fine to help protect your image while you parade around like nothing happened?" "No," he said quickly. "Not parade, just damage control, public unity. Behind the scenes, we can figure out what needs to happen. If it's divorce, fine. But until this blows over, maybe we should fake it?" He flinched. I let the silence say what I couldn't, but still I had to think practically. If temporary civility meant securing better support for our daughter, maybe there was room to negotiate. Maybe. "I'll speak to my lawyer," I said, voice steady. "We can discuss a post-nuptial agreement, financial terms, custody, boundaries." His eyes flickered with something like relief. "But make no mistake," I added, "this isn't some opening for reconciliation. You don't get to rewrite the past just because the press finally caught up to you." He nodded, slowly. "Understood." He reached into his jacket and slid a business card across the table. "Have Charles call my attorney. We'll make it work." I stood to leave, not waiting for a goodbye. As I walked out, the door chimed softly behind me, but my footsteps were firm. I didn't look back. Back at the bookstore, I sat in the upstairs loft that evening, sorting through board books and onesies again, my hands moving automatically while my mind wandered. The pain hadn't vanished. The betrayal still cut deep, but I felt stronger now. Like the storm had stripped away everything false, leaving only what mattered, me, and the child I was bringing into the world. Later that week, Charles finalized the postnuptial draft. It guaranteed health insurance, child support, a trust fund, and financial stability regardless of whether we stayed married. Marcus's lawyer reviewed and approved it, quickly, almost desperately. The Quinn Group board must have been breathing down his neck. But even with the legal lines drawn, I couldn't help but feel a hollow sadness. Our love story had once been grand, lavish, movie-worthy, and now it was reduced to contracts and public statements, an arrangement built not on affection but on necessity. Still, there was peace in the certainty. I wasn't stuck, I wasn't powerless, and I would never again be at the mercy of Marcus's decisions. That night, as I curled into bed, I whispered to my daughter, "We're okay now. No matter what happens, we'll be okay." And I believed it. The bookstore had always been a sanctuary, but now it was becoming a second chance. In the days after signing the postnuptial agreement, I found myself pouring energy into the one place that never let me down. The upstairs loft, once a quiet reading nook my father built for rainy afternoons, was now being transformed into something new. A children's reading lounge. Soft pastel colors blooming over the walls, tiny chairs lining the window, and shelves waiting for picture books and lullabies. I needed to believe in something beautiful again. Something gentle and full of promise. So I filled the space with little details, hand-painted stars, mobiles of paper moons, cozy blankets stitched by my mother, and the scent of cinnamon candles that reminded me of Christmas mornings. I wasn't doing it just for the store. I was doing it for her. My daughter still nestled within me, growing stronger with each heartbeat. I wanted her to have a space full of warmth and imagination, a place untouched by betrayal or scandal. I was climbing down from a step stool one afternoon, brush in hand, when Samantha burst through the front door of the bookstore, waving her phone like it was on fire. "Grace," she called, breathless. "You need to see this." My heart sank. What now? It's Cassandra. That name alone pulled my stomach into knots. I followed her downstairs, wiped my hands on my jeans, and took the phone. There it was, a glossy, well-lit tabloid headline flashing across the screen. "Other woman speaks out. I was lied to by Marcus Holden. Exclusive interview." The video loaded quickly. Cassandra Lane, immaculate in a soft pink dress, sat in a chic living room, framed by books and tasteful lighting. She looked like she had cried just enough to earn sympathy. Her voice was delicate, the kind that trembles but never breaks. "I didn't know he was still married," she said. "He told me they were separated. He promised he was going to file for divorce." She went on to say how devastated she was when she learned I was pregnant, that she'd ended the relationship immediately, that she didn't want to be the reason a family fell apart. I stared at the screen, watching her shift blame with grace and precision, as if she were reading from a perfectly rehearsed script. "She's spinning it," I muttered, framing herself as the victim. "She's saving her brand," Samantha replied. "Probably already got a book deal lined up." Part of me wanted to scream. Another part, perhaps the more rational side, felt oddly numb. I wasn't surprised anymore. Disappointed, yes. Disgusted, sure. But shocked, no. Not after everything. What unsettled me most was how neatly she distanced herself from the mess, leaving Marcus to twist in the wind. Later that evening, my phone rang. A number I hadn't saved, but I knew who it was. "Hello, Grace." His voice was quieter now, thinner somehow. "You saw the interview," I said flatly. "Yes." He paused. "It blindsided me." I said nothing. "I never told her I'd leave you," he added. "At least, not exactly. But I didn't correct her either. I guess that's the same thing, isn't it?" I let the silence stretch. "She's trying to protect herself," he continued. "I can't blame her for that." I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of all the choices he'd made now pressing in on both of us. "She wasn't the one who promised me forever," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She didn't hold my hand through ultrasounds or pick baby names or lie beside me while pretending to be in love. You did that." "I know," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I know I hurt you. I deserve everything that's happening right now." I closed my eyes, listening to the faint echo of remorse that finally sounded genuine. "I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness," he added. "I just wanted you to know I'm sorry, for all of it. And for the first time, I didn't hang up in anger. I didn't lash out. I didn't cry. Instead, I simply said, 'I'm not angry anymore, Marcus. I'm just done.'" He was quiet for a moment. "Does that mean?" "It means I'm moving forward, with or without you." After the call, I stood by the window of the loft, watching the last light of day slide behind the city skyline. For a long time, I just stood there, one hand resting on my belly, feeling her shift gently beneath my skin. "I'm doing this for you," I whispered. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about headlines or rumors or who said what to whom. It was about carving out a life that made sense, a life rooted in truth, even if it meant walking away from a fantasy I'd clung to for far too long. The following week, I filed the initial paperwork for full custody with Charles. We weren't finalizing anything yet, just setting the groundwork. The post-nup gave me solid footing. The court of public opinion had shifted, and for once I was no longer painted as the hysterical wife. In fact, something unexpected happened. Support started rolling in. Letters, emails, quiet phone calls, mostly from women, many of them older, who had seen their own reflections in my story. They wrote to say they admired me, that they wished they'd spoken up like I had. That flipping that table wasn't just a moment of rage, it was a moment of clarity. One woman named Eileen wrote, "Your story gave me the courage to leave a 20-year marriage where I was always treated like a placeholder. Thank you for reminding me that dignity matters more than comfort." I wept reading that. The media tried to define me with headlines, but these women, they saw me, not as a scandal, but as someone who said enough and meant it. I wasn't famous, I wasn't powerful, but somehow I'd made an impact, and in doing so I'd begun to heal. As my due date crept closer, I leaned into the simplicity of daily life. Folding baby clothes, reading poetry aloud in the loft, cooking with my mother, laughing with Samantha, sitting quietly with my father while he read in his chair. The chaos had dimmed, the noise was fading, and in the quiet, I rediscovered something I thought I'd lost. Myself. Not the version shaped by Marcus's world, but the girl who loved books, who believed in kindness, who was now slowly learning to believe in herself again. And this time, I wasn't doing it alone. I was doing it with my daughter. It happened late on a Thursday night, just as the bookstore's front lights were dimmed, and my mother was tucking a blanket around me on the living room couch. My lower back had been aching since dinner, but I brushed it off as exhaustion. I hadn't slept well in weeks. But when the tightness returned again, deeper, longer, more focused, I knew. This was no ordinary ache. This was the beginning. "Mom," I whispered, already gripping the arm of the couch, "I think it's starting." Her eyes widened, but she remained calm. She helped me to my feet, and within minutes we were in the car, with Samantha in the front seat, calling ahead to the hospital. The drive felt eternal, though I'd made that route 100 times growing up. Every red light was a betrayal, every bump in the road a jolt of pain. By the time we arrived at the maternity ward, I was in full labor. Nurses greeted me with practiced efficiency, wheeling me into a softly lit delivery room. The walls were painted a pale blue, and soft piano music played in the background. But it didn't matter. I was tunnel-focused on the rhythm of my body, the contractions that came in waves like rising tides. And then I did something I never thought I would. I reached for my phone and called Marcus. I don't know why exactly. Maybe it was the ghost of the love we once had. Maybe it was the hope that he would want to be present. Or maybe it was for our daughter. Whatever the reason, I dialed. "Hello?" His voice was groggy, uncertain. "It's time," I managed between clenched teeth. There was a long pause, then, "I'm on my way." He arrived about 30 minutes later, out of breath and flushed, still in his suit but with his tie hanging loose. He hovered awkwardly near the doorway until I motioned him closer. "I'm not here for you," I said, breathing through another wave of pain. "But I won't deny her a father if you're ready to be one." He nodded, eyes glassy. "I want to be here. I want to do this right." For the next few hours, Marcus stayed at my side. He didn't try to hold my hand unless I reached for his. He didn't say much, just rubbed my back when the nurses left the room and whispered encouragement when the pain made me cry out. For a fleeting moment, the tension between us softened. The betrayal, the lawsuits, the headlines, they all faded behind the raw urgency of birth. After 10 hours, the final push came. I remember the sound of the doctor's voice, steady and calm. I remember the sweat on my brow, my mother gripping one hand, Samantha the other, and Marcus somewhere near my shoulder holding his breath. Then a cry, a small, piercing, perfect cry. "It's a girl," Dr. Patel announced, her voice like music. "You did it, Grace." They placed her on my chest, and I couldn't breathe for a moment. Not because I was tired, but because I'd never felt anything so overwhelming in my entire life. Her tiny fingers curled instinctively around mine. Her skin was soft, impossibly warm. She blinked up at me with dark, searching eyes. Sophia. The name came to me like a whisper, like it had been waiting all along. Marcus leaned over my shoulder, his expression raw and unreadable. Sophia? He asked. I nodded. He didn't speak again. He just stared at her, as if witnessing something sacred. The hours that followed were a blur of nurses, IV drips, and paperwork. But I floated through it all. Exhausted, aching, emotional, but more whole than I had felt in months. My mother brought tea. Samantha brought cookies and demanded baby cuddles. Even the hospital staff seemed to tiptoe around the room like it was hallowed ground. Marcus came by again the next morning. He knocked softly, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers, not roses, not lilies, just humble, cheerful wildflowers. It was thoughtful, unexpected. I wanted to say thank you, he said, gently setting the bouquet beside the window, for letting me be there. For everything. I looked at him for a long moment. I didn't do it for you, Marcus. I did it for her. I know, he said, voice low, but still, thank you. He asked to hold her, and I agreed. Watching him cradle Sophia was like watching a man meet his soul for the first time. He didn't try to talk, he just held her, eyes shimmering as he studied her face. For the first time, I saw something that resembled humility in him. Maybe fatherhood would change him, maybe not. But that was no longer my burden to carry. Over the next few days, he visited regularly, never overstepping, never staying too long. The nurses adored Sophia. One even joked, she's got the lungs of a diva and the calm eyes of a philosopher. I laughed so hard I cried. But the most important thing I learned in those quiet moments wasn't about Marcus. It was about myself. I was not broken. I was not defined by betrayal or scandal or headlines. I was a mother, and in that role, I found a strength deeper than anything I'd ever known. On the day I was discharged, I stood by the hospital window, holding Sophia as the sun poured in through the glass. The world outside looked the same, but I wasn't. Marcus offered to help carry our things to the car, and I let him. My mother and Samantha flanked me like an honor guard. We moved as one, a tribe of women, tired but triumphant, stepping into the light with this new little life wrapped in pink blankets. As we drove away from the hospital, I looked at my daughter and whispered, "You're my beginning, little one." And she blinked at me, as if to say, "I know." The first few weeks home with Sophia were a blur of sleepless nights, whispered lullabies, and the scent of chamomile baby lotion. I moved through the days like someone caught between exhaustion and enchantment. Every cry pulled at my heart, every smile lit up my soul like sunrise through an old stained glass window. I had no roadmap for motherhood, but I followed instinct, feeding, swaddling, holding her close whenever the world felt too loud. We stayed in the upstairs loft of my parents' bookstore. It had been converted into a cozy nursery, with soft green walls and hand-painted clouds drifting above the crib. My father installed a small bookshelf filled with bedtime stories, and my mother crocheted pastel blankets that Sophia loved to grasp in her tiny fists. The air always smelled of old pages and cinnamon muffins from the cafe downstairs. It was imperfect but sacred, our little haven carved out of chaos. Marcus visited regularly, but always respectfully. He brought diapers, formula, stuffed animals with oversized eyes. He came with questions, not demands, unsure how to step into fatherhood but visibly trying. Some days I saw him watching Sophia like he couldn't believe she was real. Other days, he seemed unsure if he was allowed to feel anything at all. I kept my distance, not out of bitterness, but necessity. I couldn't afford to hope for the man I used to love. Not anymore. My focus had shifted entirely to Sophia. She was the sun around which my world now revolved. But life doesn't pause just because your heart is tender. One afternoon, while I was rocking Sophia in the glider chair, Charles called. "Grace," he said carefully, "Adrian's attorney just sent over a finalized draft of the post-nuptial agreement. He's ready to sign." My fingers stiffened around the bottle. "Anything I should know?" "It's generous," Charles said. "Financial support for both you and Sophia, regardless of marital status. Healthcare, a trust fund, sole physical custody with shared legal rights, very reasonable. But there's a clause. If you file for divorce now, the Quinn family wants a sealed settlement, No interviews, no media, silence. I closed my eyes. Of course, they wanted to bury the scandal, sweep it under the rug like spilled champagne. I thanked Charles and hung up. Later that evening, Marcus dropped by. He looked tired again, less put together than usual. His once pristine suits now had slightly rumpled collars. His charm seemed dulled, like silver left too long in the drawer. "I got the papers," I said before he even sat down. He didn't pretend not to know. "I figured you would," he replied. "I told them to go ahead. I don't want to fight with you anymore." I nodded, silent. "There's something else," he added. "I talked to my mother this morning. She's not taking the public fallout well. She wants to release a statement saying we've reconciled. It'll calm the investors." My jaw tightened. "I'm not a prop for damage control." "I know," he said quickly. "I told her no, but I wanted to be honest with you." I looked at him then, really looked. He wasn't the man I'd married. That Marcus had been radiant and untouchable, larger than life. This man looked like someone who'd been knocked down and hadn't yet figured out how to stand up again. "You did a lot of damage," I said softly. "Not just to me, to yourself, to her, to this family." He nodded. "I don't know if you can ever undo it." "I don't either." A silence stretched between us, filled only by the soft, sucking sounds of Sophia nursing in the next room. "I'm trying to be better," he said. "Not for you, not to win you back, just because I have to be." That mattered. Not enough to change the past, but enough to acknowledge it. The next morning, I met with Charles in his office and signed the agreement. No fanfare, no tears, just a stroke of the pen and the weight of finality. A new chapter was beginning, one with clear boundaries, legal protections, and a future I was finally beginning to shape myself. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. Women began showing up at the bookstore. Strangers, mostly, some locals, some who had driven from other towns. They came quietly, sometimes with children in tow, always with the same look in their eyes, recognition, like they'd seen my story and seen themselves. One woman, probably in her 70s, waited until I rang up her purchase before leaning in and whispering, "What you did at that restaurant, I wish I'd had that kind of courage at your age." She didn't need to say more. I squeezed her hand and smiled. Another woman left a note tucked inside a copy of Little Women. "For Sophia, may she grow up knowing her mother never accepted less than she deserved." I read it aloud that night, tears catching in my throat. Even amid the legal formalities and emotional scars, I had stumbled into something sacred, solidarity. It turned out I wasn't just reclaiming my life, I was giving others permission to consider doing the same. Marcus remained in the periphery. He came for scheduled visits, joined us for pediatrician appointments, even showed up at the bookstore with groceries once. I never invited him to stay long, and he never pushed. He seemed to understand that healing doesn't come with shortcuts, it's earned. And some doors, once broken, don't swing open again. They creak, they resist, they require grace. One night, I sat with Sophia on the rooftop of the bookstore, wrapped in a thick blanket as the city glowed beneath us. She slept soundly against my chest, her breath warm against my collarbone. I whispered to her about constellations, about resilience, about stories of women who refused to disappear. I told her the truth, that love, real love, is not measured in luxury or photographs or fairy tale weddings. It's measured in presence, in apology, in standing your ground even when your voice shakes. I told her she came into this world in the middle of a storm, but that she was not the storm. She was the calm after, the proof that something beautiful could still bloom, even from broken soil. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this emotional journey. If you're still here, it means this story touched something deep within you, and for that, I'm truly grateful. Grace's experience reminds us of a powerful truth. No matter how painful betrayal feels, we all have the strength to rise, protect what matters, and choose dignity over despair. Life won't always give us fairy tales, but it gives us choices. And when we stand tall in the face of heartbreak, we don't just heal, we inspire. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Are you tuning in from a small town, a big city, or somewhere in between? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Stories about strength, justice, and finding light after the storm. Until next time, take care of yourself and remember, you are stronger than you think.